Okay, so we're here working on the Acura CL again. What we discovered was that this car had subframe rot, and it's a very common issue on this car, actually to the point where a lot of people have actually documented this online. Now, I'll actually show you what the subframe rot is. So here is the subframe, and as you can see, I had a shop take a look at this to see if it was savable or not, but this was pretty much the crippling factor right here. You have this fracture that goes all the way through one of the support structures, and if you move this subframe by flexing it, it will actually bend down and bend up, which would explain some of the feelings I had while driving this vehicle when I initially got it. And this is actually due to an AC condensation drain that drips essentially, not essentially, literally, right over this area right here. So as the AC is working, it's dropping condensation, which is highly acidic, onto this structural piece of the car that is eventually just going to rot out anyways, which is why it's so common. So you can see there it is right through there. And if we look at the opposite side where the AC condensation line isn't dripping, it's all fine right there, no issues. So rotted out, not rotted out. And this would be basically a game over for most cars. However, I was able to source a 03 CL Type-S 6-speed, which is extremely rare, subframe out of a car that had 115,000 miles on it in a warm climate. So the combination of AC condensation on top of cold climate and salt, as you can imagine. So this car originally was from Connecticut, and that's why the salt took its toll. Didn't have that problem. So I've actually already gotten to the point where I have the rack and pinion changed over. I've got the rear engine mount on. I've got some brackets on there, and this is basically ready to go back in. Now over here we have the front subframe, so to take the rear subframe out, you have to remove the front subframe. So basically all I did with that was I cleaned it up a little bit with a wire wheel. It had some rust on it, but nothing too critical. And surprisingly, over in the area where it attaches to the rear subframe, this is where the rusted side was on the rear subframe, or rear beam to the front subframe. There's no rust on this side, but ironically, this one had a little bit more rust on the driver's side as opposed to the passenger side, which was a little unexpected, but cleaned up very well. No structural issues right here. To give it a little bit more resilience to rusting and corrosion in the future, this was all coated with a rust-resistant paint and then clear coated over it. So basically what your car would get. Obviously not the rust-proofing paint, but the paint actually converts rusted areas into a paintable surface. So now if we look at underneath the car, so I'm extending this drain line right here. This is the drain line that I was talking about where it was dripping from. The condensation would literally go to about where this clamp is and then drop right onto that rear subframe and then rusting it all out. What I'm actually going to do now is take quarter or half-inch inner diameter tubing that you can pick up at your normal hardware store. I got mine on Amazon. And this is basically, here you can actually see what it is right there. It's Terra products, Volterra products, and it is a non-pressure hose, non-toxic PVC, so it's flexible, clear, so you can actually see if there's any buildup of debris within this. And we're actually going to cut this past the subframe and then tuck it in right here so that the fluid coming out of the AC now won't drip on there. It'll actually drip behind it, which should make everything a heck of a lot easier. So that's where we're at right now. And to do all this, you have to take out the entire suspension. for the most part. You can do this without taking out the entire suspension, but it's just easier if you do take it out. So bare minimum, what you'd have to do is undo the outer tie rod ends, which you can see have been removed from this, so you have to pop the ball joints out for that, which would attach to your spindle right here. So those have to come out. You have to disconnect the power steering assembly. You have to disconnect the steering assembly. You have to drain all your power steering fluid. You have to lower the subframe, disconnect your transmission mounts, and before you do all of that, obviously, you have to support the engine. So this is a 1,000-pound engine support beam that is attached to not only the engine but the transmission, because we're taking out the entire subframe here. And this is a beam that I got from Harbor Freight. You can get it pretty cheap. I think they're like $79 without a coupon, and with the 20% off coupon, you're in the 60s easily. So fairly inexpensive, but where the expense comes in is, one, sourcing the subframe, because good luck if you have a 6-speed. The 6-speeds are different, and they are different because they have an additional shock absorber mount right here. So if you look at the automatic transmissions, you'll see a different rear engine mount altogether, but you also won't have this shock absorber mount here because they don't have the shock absorber. This shock absorber, which is specific to the 6-speed manuals, is intended to make the shift points smoother as you're going through them. So this actually attaches to the transmission in the front, but in the rear, attaches adjacent to the engine mount here. Now you can run it without it, and probably won't be that big of a deal, but I'm going for originality and keeping the car whole. So what you would have to do if you didn't get a 6-speed manual one, and you have a 6-speed manual, you would have to cut this bracket off and then have somebody weld it onto an automatic one, and that to me was just too big of a deal. So an example of the front shock absorber that I was talking about is right here. You can actually see that it mounts directly to the transmission, right around where the bell housing meets the engine. And there's another one on the rear, which you can't really see too well. I'm going to see if I can get a better angle for you, which would be right there. If you look at the end of my finger, it mounts right there and it goes up. So this is what the underneath of the car looks like right now. Got some power steering lines that are just dangling there, and then you see the whole engine supported, and there is absolutely no suspension whatsoever. And that's going to be remedied by that box right there. There's a whole suspension, front end suspension, minus the coilovers and strut assembly, because those are still usable, and I don't feel like upgrading that right now. So for the time being, no.